The door at the end of the hallway had been locked for 42 years, and the only person who ever held the key was gone. Thomas Reed had walked past that door more times than he could remember. Thousands, perhaps. Maybe more. Up the stairs in the morning, down the hallway at night, passing it without thinking, without looking, without even acknowledging that it was anything more than wood and paint, and a handle that had never belonged to him. But now it was the only thing he could see. He stood at the bottom of the staircase, his hand resting lightly on the railing, his fingers tracing the worn curve of the wood as if it might ground him in something familiar. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, the kind that settles after something has been removed. It had been 3 months since Margaret died. 92 days to be exact. He had counted at first, stopped counting after the number became too heavy to carry. The house still looked the same. That was the strange part. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same furniture, the same curtains, the same faint scent of lavender she used in the evenings. But without her, those things no longer felt like part of a life. They felt like reminders. Thomas had always believed that life was built on small agreements, unspoken ones, things you accepted without needing to understand. And that's how his marriage had worked. That's how everything had worked. And the door had been one of those agreements. The first time he saw it, it meant nothing. It was the spring of 1981, and everything in his life felt new in a way that made details seem unimportant. The house wasn't perfect. It had been slightly older than what they had planned for, the floors uneven in places, the windows letting in more draft than they should. But Margaret loved it. And when Margaret loved something, Thomas didn't question it. She moved through the house that day with quiet certainty, already imagining where everything would go. The couch should be near the window, she had said, and the table closer to the light. Thomas followed her, smiling, watching the way she saw things he didn't. Where he saw rooms, she saw a future. They reached the end of the hallway, and that's when he noticed the door. Closed, simple, unremarkable. "Another bedroom?" he asked casually. Margaret didn't answer. That pause, that small, almost invisible pause, was the first thing that didn't fit. But Thomas didn't notice it. He stepped forward anyway, reached for the handle, and that's when she touched his wrist. Soft, gentle, enough to stop him. "Please don't open that." Thomas turned to her, not confused, not suspicious, just curious. "Why?" Margaret smiled faintly, the kind of smile that ended questions instead of inviting them. Some things don't need to be part of everything else. That was all. No explanation, no story, no reason. And Thomas, being the man he was, nodded. "All right," and stepped back. That moment passed quickly, too quickly. Didn't feel important, but some decisions don't feel important when they're made. They become important later, much later. The door changed after that. Not physically, not visibly, but in meaning. It stopped being a door. It became a boundary. And boundaries, when respected long enough, disappear. Thomas stopped seeing it. Life filled in around it. Margaret made sure of that. She had a way of moving through the house that made everything feel complete. Not busy, not overwhelming, just steady. She woke early every morning, always before sunrise. The faint sound of her in the kitchen became part of the rhythm of the house. Not something Thomas noticed, something he felt. By the time he came downstairs, everything would already be ready. Coffee poured, breakfast waiting. The newspaper folded just the way he liked it. She remembered everything, things he forgot, things he never thought about. Appointments, bills, birthdays. She kept life moving without ever making it feel like work. But Thomas didn't question it. Because life worked. And when life works, you don't look for reasons why. They never had children. Margaret told him that early. It wasn't meant for me. She said it calmly, without sadness, without explanation. Thomas accepted it. Because that's what he did. He trusted her. Or, at least, he believed he did. Years passed. 10, 20, 30. The house aged slowly around them. The floors creaked louder. The paint softened. The windows rattled in winter. But inside, everything stayed the same. The same routines, the same quiet understanding, the same life. And the door. Always closed. Always locked. Always forgotten. Eventually, Thomas stopped noticing it completely. It wasn't something he ignored. It was something that didn't exist anymore. Until the day Margaret died. October 12th, a Tuesday. The kind of day that felt ordinary enough to be forgotten. Margaret sat in her chair by the window. The same chair she had used every morning for years. A book rested in her lap. Her glasses slightly tilted. But Thomas called her name. Once. Then again. And then he understood. There was no panic, no dramatic realization. Just a quiet knowing. The doctor said it was peaceful. Thomas never believed that. Because nothing about what followed felt peaceful. The house changed, slowly, but completely. The silence deepened, the room stretched, time slowed. The small sounds that once filled the space were gone. No footsteps, no quiet movement, no presence. And for the first time in 42 years, Thomas noticed the door again. It stood at the end of the hallway, exactly as it always had. Closed. Locked. Waiting. He didn't walk past it immediately. He stood there, looking. Not with curiosity, with awareness. Because now, nothing was stopping him. Margaret wasn't there anymore. The rule no longer existed. And yet he didn't move. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. The house settled into a new kind of quiet, one that felt permanent. Thomas adjusted. He made his own coffee. It didn't taste the same. He read the newspaper, didn't remember what he read. He sat in Margaret's chair sometimes, without realizing it, and still the door remained. But now it felt different. Not forbidden. Unfinished. The thought began small, then stayed. Why? Why had she kept it closed? Why had he never asked? Why had it been so easy to accept something he didn't understand? Those questions stayed with him. Until one night, everything changed. It was past midnight. Thomas walked down the hallway slowly, and that's when he heard it. The sound. Soft. From inside the room. He stopped. Because in 42 years, that door had never made a sound, not once. He stood there, listening, nothing. Then again, a faint movement. Like something shifting. Or settling. Very slowly. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, something deeper. A realization. The room wasn't silent anymore. And that meant it had never been empty. He didn't open it that night. But he didn't sleep either. Because when something changes, it doesn't go back. The next morning, he went to the kitchen, opened the drawer Margaret had always kept organized. Everything in place. Everything untouched. Except one thing. A small brass key, unlabeled, unfamiliar. And yet, he knew. Thomas held it in his hand. And for the first time in 42 years, he realized something that unsettled him more than the locked door ever had. And he had lived an entire life without asking one question that mattered. And he closed his hand around the key, and slowly began walking back toward the stairs. He climbed the stairs more slowly than he had the night before, not because his legs were weak, though they were, and not because his breathing had grown shorter over the years, though it had. He climbed slowly because the key in his hand had changed the house. It had taken something that had always existed at a distance and brought it close enough to touch. Until that morning, the locked door at the end of the hallway had been a thought he could walk past. Now it had become an answer waiting inside wood and metal, and Thomas was no longer certain that answers were always kinder than silence. At the top of the stairs, he stopped for a moment and listened, the way people do when they already know listening will not help, but cannot keep themselves from trying anyway. The house gave him only the sounds it had been giving him for months now. The ticking of the old clock in the sitting room below, A faint knock from the pipes, the whisper of winter wind against the windows at the front. Nothing from the room. Nothing human. Nothing to justify the way his chest felt too tight. He walked to the end of the hallway. The door stood there as it always had, plain and modest and impossible to reconcile with the weight it had somehow come to hold. The paint around the frame was older than the paint on the rest of the hall, he noticed now. Slightly yellower, slightly more tired. There was a thin line of dust settled where the frame met the wall, but not on the handle. That detail unsettled him more than it should have. He looked down at the brass key in his palm. It was smaller than he expected something so important to be. No label, no ribbon, no special cut to distinguish it from any other ordinary key, and yet he knew, with a certainty beyond reason, that Margaret had placed it in that drawer for him to find only when she could no longer stop him from using it. Thomas slid the key into the lock. He paused there with his hand still on the metal, not from doubt exactly, but from the sharp understanding that this was the line dividing two versions of his life. On one side stood the life he had lived. 42 years of routines, patience, small kindnesses, quiet meals, Christmases, autumns, illnesses, repaired gutters, folded laundry, shared grief when his brother died, shared laughter over absurd letters in the post, and every ordinary thread that had made his marriage feel complete. On the other side stood whatever had been kept apart from it. He turned the key. The lock gave with a soft click, and for a second the sound seemed much too small to carry such consequence. He half expected something dramatic to happen then, a rush of cold air, the groan of old hinges, some theatrical resistance from the house itself. But the door opened almost politely, as if it had never forgotten how. The room beyond was neither dusty nor abandoned. That was the first shock. It had not been left to decay. It had been maintained. The curtains were drawn, but clean. The bed was neatly made, not with fresh linen, but with care. A narrow desk stood beneath the window. A wardrobe occupied one wall. On a side table rested a lamp with a cream shade, and beneath it sat a small ceramic dish Margaret had once claimed she'd bought at a village market during a holiday Thomas never took with her. There was no smell of neglect, no stale damp, only the faint scent of paper, lavender, and something older, like cedar kept closed too long in a chest. Thomas stepped inside and closed the door behind him without meaning to. The room seemed to prefer enclosure. He stood very still, letting his eyes adjust, letting his mind resist what it was already beginning to understand. This was not a storage room, not a forgotten guest room, not a place preserved accidentally because no one used it. It was a private life arranged carefully enough to remain itself over decades. His gaze moved first to the photographs. There were many, though not displayed in any grand or obvious way. A silver frame on the desk, two smaller ones on a shelf, an album stacked neatly beneath a box, a photograph tucked into the corner of a mirror. At first, he only saw Margaret because that was all he was prepared to see. Margaret younger, Margaret in a coat he didn't recognize, Margaret with her hair pinned differently, Margaret standing by a fence, by a station platform, beside a lake, outside a narrow terraced house he had never visited. Then the other details came into focus. A child in the silver frame. A little girl with dark curls and a serious expression, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, standing beside Margaret and holding her hand with the casual possessiveness children have when they know exactly who belongs to them. Margaret was smiling in a way Thomas had never seen before, not because it was wider, but because it held the unguarded exhaustion of someone who is needed absolutely. Thomas picked up the frame with both hands, though he was not aware of deciding to. The glass felt cool. He looked more closely, as if distance might somehow change what was in front of him. It did not. The child remained there. Real. Not symbolic. Not imagined. Not borrowed. From someone else's family for a single afternoon. There were more photographs. Another of the same girl at a beach, a spade in one hand, and Margaret kneeling beside her with trousers rolled to the calf. Another in school uniform. Another at what looked like a small birthday table, candles lit, paper streamers drooping in the background. In every one Margaret was there. Younger, yes, but unmistakably herself. Not an aunt, not a family friend, not an accidental presence at the edge of someone else's picture. A mother. Thomas lowered himself slowly into the chair by the desk because his knees no longer felt entirely reliable. For several moments he did nothing but hold the frame and breathe. His mind began, as minds often do under strain, by reaching for smaller explanations before accepting the large one. Perhaps it was a niece, a goddaughter, the child of a sister Margaret rarely mentioned, but the photographs fought every such explanation by the simple intimacy of what they showed. The hand-holding, the posture, the way the girl leaned toward her without self-consciousness. Children do not lean like that into borrowed affection. They lean like that into what they trust will remain. He set the frame down carefully and opened the top desk drawer. Inside lay bundles of letters tied with ribbon, a ledger book, 2 passports, one expired and one much older, several birth certificates or copies of them, a few folded newspaper clippings, and at the very top, placed separately, a single envelope with his name on it. Not yet, he thought, and was startled by how quickly the instinct came. Some part of him knew that once he read the letter addressed to him, all the other pieces would begin arranging themselves around it, and he was not yet ready for that arrangement. He wanted the room first. He wanted Margaret without explanation. He wanted to see what she had preserved before her words came in and told him how to interpret it. So he left the envelope untouched and turned to the tied bundles. The oldest letters were dated from the late 70s before he had met her. They were from places scattered across the country, Bristol, York, Southampton, and written in several hands, though one appeared more than the others. A narrow, neat script belonging to someone named Eleanor Wade. The first letter he opened began without greeting, as if part of an ongoing conversation. I know you think distance is the gentlest answer, but she is old enough now to notice what is missing. She asks less often than she used to, which I find sadder than the questions ever were. Thomas read the line twice, then the rest. If you intend to stay away, then stay away completely. These half measures hurt more. You cannot send money and think that is shape enough for a mother. I say this without judgment if I can manage it, though I doubt I can. He stopped there, his eyes fixed on the final word, because in all his years with Margaret, no one had ever written to her like this. No one had ever addressed her as though they knew her failures as well as her tenderness. No one had ever presumed the right. He set the letter aside and opened another. This one was later. The child older. The tone softer, almost tired. She was ill for 3 days and wanted you in all the ways children want what cannot be explained to them. I told her you loved her. I do not know whether that was kindness or cruelty. Another. You were seen near the station last month. If that was you, then I wish you had come to the house. If it was not you, then I am beginning to understand that I keep expecting repentance to arrive in your shape. Another. She won a prize at school for composition. You would have laughed at the story. It was about a woman who keeps a room in her house for all the things she cannot say out loud. Children hear more than we imagine. Thomas lowered the letter slowly and looked around the room again. A room in her house for all the things she cannot say out loud. For a moment he felt almost lightheaded. Not because the phrase answered everything, but because it reached backward through decades and made a pattern where before there had only been acceptance. He imagined Margaret receiving that line years ago, reading it in private, then carrying it with her like a bruise no one else could see. Had that been the origin of this room? Had she built it into their home deliberately, not only as a place to store evidence of another life, but as a way of living inside that sentence. He opened the wardrobe next. Inside hung women's coats and dresses from earlier decades, but not Margaret's current wardrobe. These were older garments, carefully covered. On the shelf above lay a child's cardigan folded around a pair of small leather shoes, long outgrown and preserved far beyond usefulness. In a hatbox he found hair ribbons, school reports, and 3 small exercise books with a name written on the inside cover. Anna Wade. He sat back on his heels. Anna. Not the child anymore. Not a figure in photographs, a name. Names make things harder. They move them from abstraction into moral weight. He opened the first exercise book. Clumsy childhood handwriting marched across the page in pencil. My favorite thing is summer because Nana says Ma'am used to like summer too, and maybe that means we are alike. Thomas closed the book immediately. Something in that small line entered him more painfully than the letters had. Not because it revealed anything new in facts, but because it revealed a private ache he had not been present to witness. Somewhere, years before he ever knew Margaret, a child had written herself toward a mother who existed mostly as explanation and absence. And Thomas had lived 4 decades with that mother without ever knowing the child had existed. He stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back a fraction. The glass was clean. Margaret must have come in here regularly, perhaps weekly, perhaps monthly. Dust did not simply avoid rooms. It was held off by hands. What else had those hands done in here while he was downstairs reading or trimming the hedge or falling asleep in his chair? What shape had her face taken in this room? Did she sit and cry? Did she only organize? Did she read old letters and then compose herself before stepping back into their shared life? Did she stand exactly where he was standing now and wonder whether silence was still protecting anything or had long ago begun simply to preserve itself? He let the curtain fall and returned to the desk. There were legal papers beneath the second bundle of letters. One was a copy of a birth certificate. Anna Margaret Wade. Mother, Margaret Elise Wade. Father left blank. The room did not tilt exactly, but some internal line in Thomas shifted permanently. The facts were no longer insinuation. They were official, plain, typed, recorded in ink long before he entered the story. He sat down again and finally picked up the envelope with his name. Thomas. Her handwriting. Older, shakier than in the notes she used to leave him in the kitchen drawer, but unmistakably hers. He opened it very carefully as though haste might insult the dead. If you are reading this, it means I no longer have the choice to keep this room to myself. I do not know whether that thought feels like relief or failure, perhaps both. If you have opened the door quickly after my death, then I am sorrier than I can say. If you waited, then I suppose you remained exactly the man I always believed you were. And that makes what I'm about to tell you harder, not easier. Thomas had to stop there, not because he was confused, but because her voice rose from the page so clearly that he could almost hear the cadence of it. Margaret had always written the way she spoke, directly, without ornament, but with a carefulness that softened truth without disguising it. He read on. Before I knew you, I was 21 and afraid of every future, available to me. That is not an excuse, only the beginning of one. I fell in love with a man who promised bravery and vanished at the first cost of it. By the time I understood that, I was already carrying Anna. My mother was dead by then, my father impossible, and the only person who helped me was my sister Eleanor, though help is too simple a word for what it cost her. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. The letters. Eleanor Wade. Of course. I loved my daughter from the first moment I knew she existed. Please believe that before you believe anything else. But loving a child and being able to keep one are not the same thing. I was not fit in the ways the world demanded. And more shamefully, I was not fit in some of the ways my own heart demanded. I was frightened, Thomas. frightened in the mean, ordinary way people are when they think one wrong step will make the rest of their life impossible. Eleanor took Anna in for a while. A while became years. Years became a story no one knew how to untell. He looked toward the photographs on the shelf as if expecting them to contradict her. They did not. They only watched him with their old, silent proof. When I met you, I had already learned how silence can harden into identity. I told myself I would tell you before the wedding. Then after. Then when we were settled. Then when enough time had passed for the telling to feel less like an explosion. But time does not make truth softer. It only lets the lie become furniture. He let the paper drop slightly in his hand. Furniture. He thought of the dining table, the sideboard, the old rug in the sitting room. Things placed so long ago they no longer required thought. Was that what silence had become in their marriage? Not a decision repeated daily, but a piece of inherited arrangement, stepped around because it had always been there? I saw Anna when I could. Less often than she deserved, more often than was good for any of us. Eleanor insisted I remain aunt to her because children survive better, she said, with one stable story rather than several shifting ones. I hated her for being right. I hated myself more for letting her be. When you asked me once, years ago, why I seemed melancholy after visiting my sister, I nearly told you everything. Instead, I told you I was tired. He remembered that afternoon, rain on the windscreen, Margaret looking out the passenger window too long before answering him. He had accepted tired because it was the sort of answer ordinary marriages are full of. How many of those moments had there been? How many times had the truth stood at the edge of speech and he had helped it retreat by not asking again? You may think I did not trust you. The truth is worse. I trusted you too much. I trusted your goodness so completely that I could not bear to see it altered by my cowardice. I did not fear that you would leave me. I feared that you would stay and look at me differently forever. He read that line 3 times. There, it was at last. Not the practical reason, not the social one, not even the maternal failure by itself, but the intimate core of concealment. She had loved him enough to value his image of her, and feared him enough to preserve it. Or perhaps feared herself enough. The distinctions no longer mattered much. Anna grew, she married, she had a son of her own. She wrote to me more kindly than I deserved and less often than I wished. There were years when she wanted nothing from me. I accepted that because I had forfeited the right to resentment. In later years we found a sort of peace, though not the kind stories prefer. She never called me mother. I never asked her to. Thomas swallowed and read on. Everything in this room is what remained after her death 3 years ago. Yes, Thomas. Another death I kept from you, which is a sentence I never thought I would write, and one that should shame me more than it does, perhaps because by then I had become so practiced in preserving compartments that I was no longer certain where honesty belonged. Anna left the photographs to me. Her son wanted none of it. He had his own history with her, and I was only one of its shadows. He put the letter down. Anna was dead too. Somehow that fact widened the sorrow instead of closing it. It meant there would be no second knock on a different door, no late-life meeting, no chance to gather what remained and ask plain human questions face to face. Whatever shape mother and daughter had finally reached with each other, it had ended before Margaret did. Thomas was now standing among the remains not only of a hidden life, but of a hidden life already concluded. He rose and went back to the shelf with the photographs. This time he looked for resemblance not as proof, but as habit. Anna had Margaret's eyes. Not their color exactly, but the way they sat under the brow, the directness of them. In one later photograph she had Margaret's mouth too when she smiled. Her son, a boy of perhaps 10 in the only picture where he appeared, had none of either woman in him that Thomas could see. He looked bored, as boys do in family photographs, and vaguely annoyed by the whole business of being arranged. There was a box beneath the bed. Thomas pulled it out, expecting clothes perhaps, or more papers. Inside were objects too personal for display: a lock of hair tied with faded blue ribbon, a christening spoon, a school badge, a tiny broken plastic horse, a cinema ticket, a pressed flower, and beneath them all a second envelope. This one was from Anna. He opened it with less care because the dead have already forgiven roughness by then or cannot. Margaret, I am writing because saying these things in person makes both of us act younger than we are, and I no longer have patience for that. If you come on Sunday, come because you want to, not because guilt dragged you there. I have lived my whole life in the weather of your guilt, and I am too old to call it climate anymore. Thomas, actually, smiled at that despite everything. There was steel in the letter, intelligence, wit sharpened by pain. You once told me that loving someone badly is still love. I have spent years deciding whether that sentence comforted me or merely excused you. Perhaps both. I know now that Eleanor's rules were never your choice entirely, but I also know that at some point they became convenient to your fear. You were easier to forgive as a coward than as a woman who simply preferred one life over another, so perhaps I have chosen cowardice for you, because it leaves me less alone in the business of regret. He sat down again with the letter, suddenly aware that the room was doing something he had not expected. It was not merely revealing Margaret. It was surrounding him with people whose inner lives had continued perfectly well without his witness. That should not have been surprising. Every life contains other rooms. But there is a difference between knowing that abstractly and having the papers. The photographs, the handwriting of strangers make it literal. He read to the end. If it matters now, I never hated you. Children say they do, but what they mean is usually simpler. You hurt me in a place I couldn't reach back into. I think, in your way, you loved me every year of my life. I only wish your way had been larger. After that, Thomas sat for a very long time without reading. Outside the closed curtains, evening had started to gather. The house beyond the room remained silent, but now the silence had altered. Before, it had felt empty. Now it felt crowded, not by ghosts or fear, but by truth finally taking up the space it had always required. He thought about Margaret downstairs in the kitchen over all those years, measuring tea leaves, folding dish towels, asking whether he wanted another slice of pie, while this room existed above them like a second pulse. He thought about the times she had returned from visiting Eleanor and stood a little too long at the sink before speaking. The birthdays when she went quiet in September. The one Christmas she had cried over nothing, apparently, while wrapping a child's red scarf she said was for charity. Not nothing. Never nothing. Every marriage, he realized too late, is partly built from the stories two people can bear to live inside. He had believed theirs was simple because he was allowed to live in only half of it. By the time darkness had fully settled outside, Thomas folded the letters back into their bundle with more tenderness than they had first received from him. He did not feel calm. He did not feel resolved. He felt old in a new way. Not just in the body, but in the understanding that some revelations arrive after the years in which they could have changed action, leaving only interpretation behind. When he finally rose to leave the room, he stopped in the doorway and looked back once more. Nothing in it threatened him now. It had never threatened him. That was perhaps the cruelest part. The room had not been keeping danger from the house. It had been keeping complication from a marriage that preferred order. Margaret had not preserved another life because she loved Thomas too little. She had preserved it because by the time she loved him enough, she had already hidden too much to know how to turn back. He did not lock the door when he left it. That small decision mattered more than he expected. The next morning, he went back in with a box from the attic and began bringing things downstairs one by one, not to erase the room, but to refuse its secrecy. He placed the framed photograph of Margaret and Anna on the sitting room mantel. He put Anna's letter in the drawer of the side table beside his chair. He left Margaret's letter on the dining table for an hour before folding it carefully into his wallet, where he carried her grocery notes for years. On the third day, he called the number on the back of an old envelope addressed to Eleanor Wade's former address. He did not expect anyone to answer. A younger woman did. When he asked if she knew Anna Wade, there was a pause long enough to gather caution. "She was my mother," the woman said. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. He had not known there was a granddaughter to the story. Or perhaps he had. Perhaps the photograph of the boy should have prepared him for generation, continuing as it always does. But hearing the living voice of someone linked to the room made his own feel strangely fragile. "My name is Thomas Reed," he said. "I was Margaret's husband." There was another pause. Different this time. Less caution, more recognition. "I wondered if you'd ever call," she said. They spoke for nearly an hour. Her name was Julia. Anna had been her mother, yes, and Eleanor her grandmother in every meaningful way before she died. She knew about Margaret. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Enough to carry both resentment and sympathy in the same breath. Enough to say, she used to, come when she could, without making it sound like praise. Enough to ask him, very quietly, did she love him? You, I mean. Thomas looked at the room's open door while answering. "Yes," he said, "she did." The truth of that surprised him less now than it might have earlier. It was easier, after finding the room, to understand that hidden things do not always cancel visible ones. Sometimes they simply live alongside them and deform them in silence. Julia visited the following week. She was in her 50s, older around the eyes than photographs could have predicted, and when she stood in the sitting room looking at the frame Thomas had placed on the mantel, he saw Margaret in her immediately, not in features alone, but in the way she held still before entering a difficult conversation, as if steadying both herself and the room around her. They drank tea at the table Margaret had polished every Sunday. They spoke more honestly than politeness would normally permit, between strangers, because grief makes a strange kind of family quickly when the dead have done the introductions badly. Julia did not accuse him of knowing. That was a kindness he had not expected and could not entirely accept. "I should have asked more," he said once. She looked at him for a long moment. Maybe, but she should have told more too. That was the closest either of them came to judgment, and it was enough. When Thomas showed her the room, she stood in the doorway for a long time before going in. She touched the back of the desk chair, the edge of the wardrobe, the box of childhood things beneath the bed. At the sight of the little broken horse, she laughed and cried at once. "I broke this on the radiator," she said. "Gran told me not to tell anyone because I'd only be punished twice, once for the horse, once for the lie." Thomas almost asked whether Margaret had been there that day, but he did not. He was learning, even now, that every life need not be pried completely open to be honored. Some things, once known in shape, can be left with their edges intact. Julia took some of the letters with her, not all. Some, she said, should stay. She kept them here for a reason, she told him. Perhaps because she wanted one place where all the versions of herself could still be in the same room. After Julia left, the house felt different again, not lighter. Lighter would have been too simple, almost insulting, but less divided. The open doorway at the end of the hall no longer looked like a threat or an accusation. It looked like part of the house finally admitted into it. Spring returned slowly. Thomas found himself speaking to Margaret sometimes when he passed the room, though not in anger. Not even in forgiveness exactly. Something gentler and more difficult than both. He would stand by the open door and say things too late to matter, practically, but important to say anyway. "You should have told me. I would have stayed. I might have been angry. but I would have stayed. Or perhaps, on harder days, why didn't you trust my love more than your fear? No answer ever came, of course, but the asking changed him. It gave shape to thoughts that otherwise would have sunk into the general swamp of loneliness and become indistinguishable from it. Months later, while sorting the last of the papers, he found one more note folded into the back of a ledger. Margaret's handwriting again, but much older, perhaps written near the end, when she had begun to prepare things quietly. Truth does not arrive when it is useful, only when it is ready, or when we are no longer strong enough to keep it out. If Thomas ever opens this room, I hope he understands that what I hid was not proof that I loved him less. It was proof that I did not know how to survive being fully known. Thomas read that line standing by the window in the room she had kept separate for so long. Then he sat on the bed and cried properly for the first time since her funeral. Not only for the lie, not only for Anna, not only for the years, but for the small, frightened young woman Margaret had once been before he ever knew her. The one who loved a child and failed her, loved a man and hid from him, and then spent 4 decades tending the evidence of both because she could not bear to lose either completely. In the end, that was what remained with him. Not betrayal, not even secrecy, frailty, human frailty, stretched across a lifetime and arranged so carefully it almost resembled character. If you spent your whole life loving someone and discovered, after they were gone, that there had been an entire hidden room inside them, would you judge them for the silence, or would you sit with the sadder truth that some people are not dishonest because they lack love, but because they lack the courage to survive being known completely? That is what I keep returning to. And if you've stayed with me this long, tell me what you think you would do. Open the door, or leave it closed and protect the version of love that never had to answer for itself. And if this story reminded you of someone, share it with them. Some truths arrive too late to change the past, but not too late to soften the way we carry it.